Viktor Orban's intervention in Ukraine is interesting. First of all, his meeting with President Zelensky is to be commended, I suppose. But at that meeting, he called for a ceasefire with Russia, which, of course, effectively means capitulation. Effectively, it's not putting down your weapons, it's stopping defending yourself from the aggressor. It reflects his unique position in Europe at the moment as an ally of President Putin and a critique of the broader European approach to the conflict. His stance is at odds with the majority of Western leaders who generally support Ukraine's resistance against Russian aggression without immediate conditions. His proposal of a ceasefire is controversial because it suggests halting hostilities first, potentially without addressing the core issues such as Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. The approach contrasts sharply with President Zelensky's insistence on a just peace, which includes the return of occupied territories and maintaining Ukraine's path towards EU, if not NATO membership, but certainly its path towards what it wants rather than what Russia dictates. And that's the point. And that's the reason why the Minsk agreement was something that Zelensky wanted to revise, abandon, discard. And I would suggest that that was one of the major reasons why Putin took his decision to invade in 2022. Orban's visit to Kyiv and his calls for a ceasefire don't necessarily translate to increased support for Zelensky. Instead, they highlight the growing divisions within the European Union regarding the strategy for dealing with the Ukraine-Russian war. And Hungary, under Orban, has now become a vocal dissenting voice, delaying European aid to to Ukraine, and maintaining a more conciliatory approach to Moscow. I think a conciliatory approach to Moscow is not necessarily a bad thing, and Europe and Britain should open up dialogue with Moscow, particularly with other voices outside the Kremlin. But I think it's important to have that conversation with the Kremlin. I don't think it's important for Zelensky to have that conversation. Zelensky is at war. We are not at war. We should be talking. And the sanctions regime that we have instituted, together with the United States, stops that talking and is foolish. We have a reason to negotiate with the Kremlin because we can negotiate about our continued sanctions. And that is a way forward to help towards peace, rather than pushing Zelensky into a position where he has to declare a ceasefire before entering talks with Russia, which are predicated on Russia keeping its territory, which is redefined, the territory which it's already seized, plus more, that it hasn't gained militarily. All of that, Russia in its grandeur thinks can be part of Russian territory. It's wrong. I think the final result will be a slice of eastern Ukraine, which will become a sort of quasi-independent territory after negotiations, and that may be the only future. I think Ukraine and Zelensky have to concede that although Crimea should be returned to Ukraine as Ukraine's property, it will be predominantly a Russian base. And that is what it has been for a long time anyway. But that is probably the only credible terms for a lasting peace. But that's not something that Russia can dictate. It's something that we in the West can encourage and enable. And so it's good to see Orban's visit because it represents a potential thaw in the Hungary-Ukrainian relations, and his proposal and rhetoric simply articulate the fact that there isn't a united front, an absolutely united front that the EU can present, but it is a 99% united front. Orban is a very small naysayer. But the fact that he is talking to Zelensky is a positive. Zelensky's focus should remain on securing continuous and sufficient military and economic support from Europe to withstand and resist Russian aggression, and that is something that is supported by recent EU decisions to use frozen Russian assets for military aid, bypassing Hungary's veto, and ensuring that the primary player in this dialogue is Zelensky. But we should be thinking about what we can negotiate directly with Putin in terms of lifting sanctions. That is a way forward. And Zelensky will say, well, sanctions have been effective. Sanctions are crippling the Russian economy. They are. But sanctions are the only leverage tool that we've got, given the fact that we have stopped communicating. We need to start communicating, and we must communicate about something. And sanctions are a topic that should be on the table, I'm afraid.